Augustine Ramirez, and they will be getting married on, I think, October 17th.
16th.
October 16th. Okay. So this will be a pleasant afternoon for her to make this presentation to us. That's it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Palmer, for that introduction, and I'm very pleased to speak to you all today. I am a member of Delta Sigma Pi Phi Fraternity Incorporated as well, and with my degree from the University of Texas, Austin is very close to my heart. So welcome. I welcome you all here today to Waco, Texas, and I hope y'all stay with pleasure. My fiancé passed out a handout that he prepared for you all today about my topic. And I will discuss racial profiling, specifically focusing on September the 11th and the terrorist attacks and how media coverage changed because of that event. I'll discuss the media coverage prior to September the 11th and how it changed after September the 11th. But before I begin that discussion, there are some frames, some information that you all need to be familiar with, some key terms. The first term is framing. Are you all familiar with what framing is? I have a quick definition on my handout. Where framing is something that occurs when journalists select one aspect of a topic and they choose to focus on that particular aspect. So it's not done on purpose, whereas spin is actually done on purpose. I know you all have heard of someone placing a spin on a topic, and that's actually done intentionally. But framing is different because framing is not usually intentional. Framing is usually done because of the background that a person has. It may be because of their race, their religion, their gender. It's because of the things that they bring to the table as a human being. It's based on those things. Okay? So this is just a textbook definition. I am a professor, so if y'all feel like I'm teaching today, let me know. I'm going to try to set it so that it's informal, but I always incorporate a little bit of teaching into my talk because I think it is important for people to learn new information. But framing, as I said before, it occurs when journalists select one aspect of the perceived reality and they make it more salient, or they tend to play up that particular aspect of the topic in their coverage. Objectivity, that's something that you all are all familiar with, but I propose in my paper that although journalists try to be objective, in the end it's impossible to be objective. And why do y'all think that's true? Why is it impossible to be objective as a reporter? Personal biases. What else? Your sources. What else? Pardon? Okay, your employers. Good. Because an example of that would be if you write for Fox and your article has a liberal spin, what will they do to you? Well, they ask you to do your story. They'll ask you to rewrite your story. So that's very good. Okay, so this is a definition of what the journalist's role is in reporting. The journalist's role is to define the meanings of an event for their audience, and they actually go out and cover an event, and what they write is from their perspective. It's what they see, it's what they choose to attend to. So that's why in the end, journalists end up framing topics. Okay, the making of a frame. These are some of the things that go into the making of a frame. As I said before, it's going to be race, the type of education that a person receives, their socioeconomic status. All of those things are going to make a difference in how a person frames the topic. And these are the ways that we can actually see frames in the media. The first one is going to be the topic that's discussed. The second one is going to be sources. Someone mentioned sources over here. The types of sources that they choose to interview. If they're liberal, then they're probably going to choose to interview people who are more liberal in nature. If they're conservative, they're going to interview people who are conservative. So that's how frames they come forth based on sources. Another one would be sizing, the type of focus or the attention that a newspaper gives to a topic. That's sizing. That's also going to result in framing. And the last one is photos. This is an example of how a newspaper can frame the topics with photos. If you see the picture that's on the left, you picture as an unemotional ice queen, whereas on the right, she looks very caring, very friendly, very nice. And you see this a lot in the news where just through photographs, they're able to put a particular spin on a topic. Okay, sources is another one. Reporters can add credibility to a topic, or they can take credibility away based on the type of sources they have for a story. If, for example, they're writing a story about welfare or a topic and they're a conservative person, then they may choose to interview someone who's not considered mainstream based on societal values. Whereas if there's someone who, if they're more liberal and maybe their mother had to go on welfare for a few months, just to get back on her feet, they may look for a variety of sources when they're writing a story about welfare. Do you all see how that works? Okay, so just by the types of sources that you interview for a story. Okay, we saw a lot of framing examples with the Reverend Chairman Connor Wright debacle during the Barack Obama campaign. What were some examples of framing with that debacle? Examples that emerged.
Anti-American.
Okay, yeah, that he was anti-American. What were some other examples? He was racist. If his pastor is racist, he must be racist. Yeah, just showing that clip over and over and over. And what were some differences that you all saw with Fox versus MSNBC and how they covered that topic?
I don't watch Fox.
Personally, I don't watch it either, but just can you just guess?
It was snippets of, what
Okay,
they brought out. They
great,
didn't really,
great.
so
They took it out of context.
All
They
right.
didn't show, or they didn't say, well, this is just a portion of his speech or a portion of his sermon. They showed it as if his whole sermon focused on some of that negative information. How did MSNBC cover it?
the right way.
They covered it. They talked about it being taken out of context, and this was just a portion of his sermon. The liberal way. And also, they also discussed the idea that this was his pastor, this was not Barack Obama. And just because his pastor feels this way doesn't mean that he has the same beliefs. So that was the difference in coverage there. And so that was a very good example of framing. And so getting to our topic today of racial profiling, before September the 11th, it was primarily covered as a problem for African Americans, for Hispanics, and the idea that they were pulled over for no other reason than the color of their skin. And that's how it was predominantly covered before September the 11th. Okay, and so my book, the book that I have, actually there's a sheet on the last page. I'll go ahead and give the plug now where you can order a copy of this book if you'd like. I will take orders at the end, or if you'd like to send it in on your own, you're more than welcome to do that. So my book mostly looks at how black press versus mainstream media covered racial profiling and how they covered it before September the 11th versus after September the 11th. So those were the primary factors that I looked at. This is just a definition, a textbook definition of black press. It is defined by Dates and Barlow as newspapers and magazines that are aimed at African American readers that speak to their issues. So that's a good definition of black press. Yes.
You don't have owned by African Americans or equity interest by African Americans.
Usually they're owned by African Americans, but as we know, sometimes African Americans will sell a publication to make money. But if the publication covers African American issues, then it is considered black press. And that was the main thing that I was concerned with.
Also, you didn't have anything about broadcasting, you had radio or other as well.
I looked at predominantly newspapers. In my study, I looked at newspapers only. And some of my other studies, I've looked at magazines and I've looked at online media. But for this particular study, I actually began this study in 2001. And so back then, online media was popular, but it wasn't as popular as it is now. And so that's why I chose to just look at newspapers only. Okay? All right, and general press, on the other hand, is defined by publications that are directed to the general population, and usually they're erroneously perceived as presenting a continuous objective coverage of issues in areas of interest. So those are the primary differences in mainstream media and black press. Okay? And so I thought that I was justified in my comparison because both groups have a different goal in mind or a different objective, and that's why I decided to look at black press versus mainstream media. Okay, and framing, I thought that this was a very important topic for me to look at because people are able to gain attention and gain support for an issue just based on the types of frames that they present in a newspaper. That's why we're concerned with framing to begin with, because just based on the stories that we see on the news and based on the frames that we see, that can encourage us to become either more supportive of an issue or less supportive. Do you all agree with that?
Absolutely.
So that's why we were concerned with frames to begin with. Some people might say, well, why does it matter? It's just a part of life. Well, it is a fact of life, but it's also important because you can gain support for a certain issue just based on the types of frames that you present. Okay, and it's also been shown that the types of frames that are presented, they can shape the public perceptions of an issue, and also the types of political issues that institutions are concerned with. That's also something that can be achieved through framing. Okay, and I use what's called a textual analysis, and that's where you actually look at the text of a publication, and you read the text, and you look for underlying words, underlying catchphrases, underlying meanings, or meanings that are present within that text. And so that's actually what my study consisted of. And it's usually appropriate when you're trying to give voice to a marginalized group, because other studies that are more qualitative in nature tend to just look at numbers only, or, like how many times a source was used. They just look primarily at numbers versus the underlying meanings in the text. So I was primarily concerned with the underlying meanings and the frames that were within the text versus just counting something or counting the number of times that something occurred in that type of study. So that's why I chose a textual analysis versus a traditional qualitative analysis. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, and so previous studies have shown that the print media usually fare poorly when it comes to framing African Americans or minorities in the media. Usually African Americans, as you all know, they're framed in a very negative manner, where they just show the negative aspects of African Americans. They usually associate them with crime or anything that's negative, and so that's what previous studies have shown.
Excuse me, question.
Yes.
Since you're mentioning profiling and focused on that, the recent issues in the immigration laws in Arizona,
Yes.
and that, how do you see that? What's your
The way those are framed, the recent issues, I think now framing with that is that many people are focusing on the aspect of why they're concerned